This is Unexpected with Hannah Love. In this podcast, you will gain a new perspective of how God loves you enough to call you to things that you couldn't have imagined for yourself. Hi guys, I am thrilled to welcome my sweet and beautiful friend Demi-Leigh Tebow. She is here with us today. Hi Demi.
Hey Hannah, it is so good to see you. It has been way too long.
So long. I think a couple of years since we've seen each other.
Yeah, actually, but I love Nashville so much, so don't even give me two excuses to get there.
Get over here and have dinner. It's so good to have you on, Demi. I am so excited for you. I have been able to read some of your new book, and I can't wait for the world to see it. Honestly, it's such a vulnerable book, and it's such a practical book. I guess I'll rewind a little bit. I'm going to toss it over to you because on Unexpected, I like for people to share a little bit of their testimony, a little bit of what brought them to this point, and then we will jump into your book and you can share more about what God has done in your life.
Oh, well, thank you, Hannah. Hannah, I love that this podcast is titled Unexpected, and I think that's so much of what this book is based on is the unexpected, let me call it identity crisis that I found myself in after, achieving something that I thought was great and was going to set me up for really the rest of my life. I was so fortunate to be able to represent my home country, South Africa, as Miss Universe back in 2017. But, Hannah, the day came where I had to give that crown back. I literally had to take it off my head and give it to the very rightful next, very worthy winner. And I remember handing over that crown, finding my way backstage, finding my dressing room, rushing to get to the airport to get back to my home country, South Africa. And Tim and I were only dating at that time, and he flew he cut a family trip short, flew halfway across the world to come and support me for even just a few hours, which I'm so thankful for. And as we're rushing to the airport, I don't know if I necessarily realized it in the moment, but I realized I don't know if I realized exactly what it was, but in that moment, rushing to the airport after I handed over my crown, I realized I forgot something. I forgot something pretty important back on that stage, and it wasn't just my crown. It actually ended up being my identity. And the mistake I made was I rooted a lot of my worth and my value in something that was temporary, something that was never going to last. And, I mistook that crown for my purpose, but later I realized that that was just a vessel to be able to live out my purpose. And Hannah, chasing our dreams, chasing that maybe corner office or that bigger stage. I know you're very familiar with stages, or chasing that promotion, chasing that next paycheck. It's not that those things are bad things. It's when we root our worth, our value, essentially our identity in those things, where it becomes a tightrope that we're walking. And at some point or another, we are going to feel like we are failing and like we are letting ourselves down. I know that's how I felt.
That's so right. Gosh, and I love that you're so vulnerable about this because I think that this is something that probably everyone will struggle with at some point in their life. I know a lot of women that I talk to, it's usually the point after college, right? Where you
Yeah.
graduate and you're going out into the real world and you're looking for the job and you're looking for the thing that's going to tell you who you are. I think that can be very difficult when you've grown up thinking this is the path, this is what I'm going to do, and then this is how my life is going to play out. But again, God is in the unexpected. And I think it is in those moments of recognizing that our worth isn't in the thing or the title, or even in the mistakes that we've made.
Yeah.
Because some people tie their identity to an issue, like the woman in the Bible with the issue of blood. It's so funny because I began reading your book. I was thrown back. The very first episode that I put out this year was "Are You Your Issue?" And I again talk about identity and how some people think that they are who the world says they are
Mm-hmm.
because the world loves labels.
Yeah.
And it's not even, sometimes we give ourselves the label, and
Yeah.
sometimes we allow the world to give us a label or
Mm-hmm.
the job or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, but if we make the mistake of believing that and coming into agreement with that,
Mm-hmm.
then we are losing the true identity, which is a daughter of the king,
Yeah.
right? And so I'm just loving so much that you are shining light on this because it's something that's real and that I think every woman, every person across the board will struggle with at some point in time. Even, I think of Tim and how there were probably moments after his football career. He probably had to sift through some of that. I think of
Mm-hmm.
Shay and, when he retires one day, if his identity was tied to being a singer, who would he feel he is? But
Mm-hmm.
fortunately, we have foundations, and God has been so good to reveal to us who we are and that our worth is in being a child of God.
That's right. That's so good, Hannah. I love what you mentioned about labels. My book is actually subtitled "You Are Not Your Label," and Hannah, I think of like, yes, the label I wore. I remember my bags got tagged as not Demi-Leigh Peters back then, but as Miss Universe. The doorman greeted me as Miss Universe. I was introduced as Miss Universe. The label on the door for the TV interviews I would do, like at the little play, it was like not Demi, it was Miss Universe. And that was the label that I got given. And to be honest with you, Hannah, like I liked wearing that label, and there might be many labels that we are given that we actually like wearing. You like wearing probably the label of being a mama bear. Like I like being a wife. Like there's many labels that I like wearing. And for me, this was a label that I actually loved wearing that got ripped off. And it felt like it was a moment where literally the rug was ripped from underneath my 6-inch high heels moment, where it was a moment of what's next. And, you mentioned that a lot of us go through that, especially after college. You got this degree, this dream degree, this degree that was going to go and set you up for whatever you want it to be. It was going to get you the perfect job. It was going to get you that paycheck. It was going to, eventually get you that promotion. And then when those things don't realize, when you apply for that job after job after job and keep getting no's, that's when that label isn't necessarily coming through for us like we wanted it to, or like we needed it to, or like we thought it was going to. I remember a friend, or actually a colleague of mine, when I was preparing to go and compete for Miss Universe, she told me, Demi, if you win Miss Universe, you will not have to worry about another thing the rest of your life. You will have so many opportunities. If your life will be set for you. And I believed it. I believed it in that moment. I thought, yeah, like if I get that degree, if I do these things, it will all be fine. And Hannah, we've learned that that's not the way that necessarily life works. And I love what Proverbs 16:9 says. It says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. And man, Hannah, am I so thankful that the plans I had for my life a lot of times did not go according to plan, that there was a big wrench thrown in those plans so that the Lord can plan my step or establish my steps, because I know that His plan for my life, I have seen that through and through, is always so much better than I could ever wish or plan for.
That's right. And I love to say, if we didn't get lost sometimes, we wouldn't need a navigation system, right?
Yeah,
It's like
that's
if
right.
everything was going our way all the time, we would not feel like we needed to depend on God.
I'm
And
writing
it's
that down, Hannah. That's so good.
so it's in those moments of being lost that oftentimes I feel we are more able to surrender, because you do to an extent have to come to the end of yourself to then look up and say, you know
Hmm.
what, God, what I had for me isn't working. My plans aren't working.
Yeah.
I know you have something for me, and it's better than what I could have ever dreamed or imagined. And I think of that verse in Ephesians, that God has abundantly more than we could, ask or even imagine. And I just cling to that sometimes. And Demi, I just have to tell you, I'm a reader. I've always loved reading. I've always loved writing in English, and I love the way that you have put this book together. It's so practical and it's so beautifully written. You're very conversational in style, but also it's broken up into the 4 parts,
Yeah.
which I find so helpful and practical, like you
Mm-hmm.
said. You are leading women or whoever's reading this book on this journey to go with you, and you are being vulnerable and you are sharing bits of your life and the work that you've done to invite women into that journey with you. And it resonated so much with me because I started reading and I was like, whoa, like I've done this. And you laid it out in these steps. So the first is dig
Mm-hmm.
and plant and grow and flourish.
Yeah.
And as soon as I got into the dig portion, I was just like, this is what I mean. I've spent many, many episodes talking and sharing about the work that needs to be done to go back, to heal places, so that God can then put you in the place that He really wants you to be. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that you couldn't get there another way, but until you are wholly restored, until you've gone back to all those places and allowed God to heal those wounds or those lies that we believed. And it's shocking, really, because once you start doing the work, you're like, oh, this was my circumstance,
Mm-hmm.
and this
Yeah.
was what, as a child, I thought this said about me.
Yeah.
Right? It's so difficult. Why do you think it is so difficult for people to start the dig?
Because it's hard work and it's messy. It's messy. I wish I could say that I have a green thumb. This plant back here literally is a self-watering plant. It like holds water for a month. The fact that it's still here is a miracle. But I wish I could tell you that I have a green thumb, Hannah. I don't. However, I am a very visual and a very practical person. I like to go and like actually do the work. It was so important for me to really make a crown that lasts applicable to my readers. I understand that not everybody can necessarily relate to being in the beauty industry or a pageant queen or a Miss Universe, but we all have walked through situations in our lives where we can relate with one another. And I really wanted to give my readers the ability to go and read this chapter, read my story, read the roadmap that I have along the way figured out to navigating certain life circumstances, but to go and like make that practical and impactful in their own lives. So I divided the book into 4 sections: dig, plant, grow, and flourish. And in the digging section, we are really it's going to be messy. Like, it's not necessarily going to be hard. When you think of digging in your garden, like, you might get some like dirt under your nails, you might chip a nail, you might, sweat a whole lot. Like, it's not necessarily going to be pretty. And that's the section where I really wanted us to go and dig up the tangled, messy roots of our identity, because in order to go and plant new seeds of truth in our life, we have to uproot those weeds of doubt, those weeds of insecurity, those weeds of, all the things that we are not necessarily, those weeds of fear. We have to go and uproot those. Sometimes they're tangled in our identity before we get to go and actually put in the work. We have to go and prepare. I always said, like, you have to go and prepare the soil, the ground, in order for it to receive good, healthy, new seeds of truth that you get to implement in your life.
That's exactly right. And in fact, the timing of this couldn't be more perfect because we got back 2 days ago from being gone for a month in Arkansas. And when we came back, I walked onto our front porch and I was like, oh no, absolutely. And I had let it go before we left for Arkansas. It's hot, the kids are out of school, so we've been really busy, but it was absolutely overgrown. I mean, we just have like the normal shrubs and like evergreen situation out there, but you couldn't even see some of it for all of the weed growth. And I spent all day yesterday, all day with this little tool, just digging up these roots of these
Yeah.
weeds, literally from morning until dawn. Like, I went to bed last night and you're exactly right. I was filthy. I was covered in dirt, but it felt so good to do the work. And as I lay in bed, again, I was looking at your book and I was just like, man, this is it. You have to go and you have to tear out what doesn't belong and what is taking the good and the nutrients from the soil and is taking up space, and you have to uproot it so that
Mm-hmm.
there's room for what God
Yeah.
intended, so that you can plant what is true and what is right. And you know, there will be things that you go back to, and they're not necessarily bad things,
Mm-hmm.
but doing the work. And I say this because Shay and I did a marriage intensive a couple of years ago, and we've been very, very transparent about this. But I went into it going, this is going to fix all of our problems. You know, like, actually, this is going to fix all of Shay's problems. And we came out the first day, and we had done these storyboards of our lives, and we were forced to sit down and review our whole life in these little thumbnails of just events that impacted us.
Mm-hmm.
And she went through everything that we talked about and wrote what she heard us saying. And at the end, she ran out of sticky notes for me, which was embarrassing. And the takeaway was that I had chronic trauma, which was shocking. I mean, Shay's was like, oh, you make lemons into lemonade and you have chronic trauma. And no one was more surprised than I was, because I had a wonderful childhood. I
Mm-hmm.
grew up on a farm. There's nothing you could have said to me that was like, oh, that was impactful in a negative way
Mm-hmm.
in my childhood. But when you sit down and you're forced to review, and sometimes it's nice to have help to do that, like an
Mm-hmm.
outside person, because
Yeah.
we did in that marriage intensive. It was another husband and wife, Christ centered. It was wonderful, but it was so hard. It was the hardest 3 days
Mm-hmm.
uh, that I have had of just digging into the way that I saw myself and the way that I functioned and the way that I responded
Mm-hmm.
to things in life. Did you go to see anyone, or did you just take it to the Lord and ask Him to reveal to you areas that you needed to go back and let Him touch?
Yeah, Hannah, my stepmom is actually she's got her PhD in neuropsychology. She's a clinical psychologist and she still practices till this day. And it's been her like lifelong dream and calling to be able to help people. And I met my parents were divorced when I was really young, and I met my stepmom when I was about 3 years old, and I've known her ever since. And I can't necessarily say that I have gotten therapy just throughout my life, but I think it would also be unfair to say that my stepmom might or might not have planted some really good seeds in my life and given me some really practical skills and tools on how to navigate certain situations. I think for the most part of my life, I just thought I'm talking to my mom. She really is like, I'm so grateful to have two women in my life that I see as mom figures. And I just thought I'm talking to my mom. Maybe there was some counseling happening without me even knowing it. However, in my book, Hannah, I write a whole chapter on a very traumatic incident that I lived through. I was carjacked and held at gunpoint by multiple armed men in my home country, South Africa, a couple of years ago. It's probably been 7 years at this point. And that was a very traumatic incident. And, that incident led me to feeling like I totally had a victim's mentality where I blamed myself for it. It happened broad daylight, peak hour traffic, on a big avenue, bumper to bumper traffic. And somehow I blamed myself for it. Somehow I, fabricated this lie in my head that I was too dressed up, or I was an easy target, or my brain resorted to all these things instantly. And I realized later on that asking for help is not weakness, it actually is courageous. And I realized that I need to get ahead of this situation before it becomes a bigger deal than it needs to be. throughout the rest of my life. I suffered with acute, I think you call it ASD, acute stress disorder, which is something that occurs after a traumatic incident like what I lived through. But I also learned that if you address that as soon as possible, I think the statistic is something like within 72 hours, you drastically bring down the option for that to turn into something like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that was something that, my stepmom told me, like, hey, if you get help sooner rather than later, it's only going to help you in the long run. And at first I was Miss South Africa at the time, Hannah. At first I didn't want that story to be known to people. I didn't want people to know about it. I felt like I was going to be seen weak, as a failure, as an easy target. All of these things that you and I know now is not true, but our brains want to find someone to blame or something to blame. And for whatever reason, the easiest person to blame, because I could control it, was myself, right? And so that was a moment that I lived through where I did seek professional counseling help. And I believe the therapy that we did was the EMDR therapy, and it was so helpful. I remember shortly after that incident, once I moved back into my apartment, they got away with my house keys and my remote of my gate. And that was terrifying because I didn't know what their intent was. They weren't able to catch the men till this day. And I remember washing my hair in the shower, having locked myself into 3 different doors, and I was washing my hair with my eyes open because I was too scared that the water was going to prevent me from hearing if somebody had come in. So I just wanted to keep literally, talk about sleeping with an eye open, right? I realized that, Demi, you have to work through this, and it doesn't, asking for help is actually courageous. It does not equate to weakness. And Hannah, I'll also just say, we talked about the digging section, and we even talked a little bit about planting new seeds of truth in our life. But when you think of like the growing phase in your life, now you've gotten the base ready to go and plant those new seeds of truth. But once those little seedlings are blooming and sprouting, like in that growing phase, there's still work that needs to be done. There's still pruning that takes place. There's still, you need to water that plant. This poor guy. You still need to water that plant to keep it growing. And it doesn't mean now, okay, you've done the messy work, you've planted the new seeds of truth in your life. You actually have to go and upkeep that. And sometimes that means following up, circling back, making sure that the things you have implemented in your life, you're not letting go of that, but you're following through on them, right?
That's right. I love that you talk about that. And also in your book, I believe you say something to the effect of there has to be intentional action.
Yeah.
And I love that because you are, again, giving practical step by step. You're like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, now you've done this work. The
Yeah.
next thing you need to do is intentionally move toward,
Mm-hmm.
right, the thing that God is calling you to now that you've started this work. And I
Yeah.
love that you also said you have to maintain it. Not something that's just going to keep itself. A garden doesn't keep itself. You have to continually go back. You have to continually weed and prune. And, the Bible is full of the symbolism of plants and gardens and vineyards. And I love that he talks about that over and over again in a different capacity because it's
Yeah.
all going back to the maintaining of what is good and what God has intended.
Yeah, I love that so much, Hannah. One of the chapters I wrote is named Work Through the Weight. And like you said, that action needs to be intentional. You have to go and implement. You actually have to go and do the work. After I handed over my title and moved back to New York City, Tim and I were engaged at that time. I entered a pretty severe waiting season, and a lot of that time just felt wasted. And I didn't know that I needed to uproot some weeds of doubt and insecurity. I didn't know that I needed to go and plant new seeds. It just felt like time was being wasted. I didn't know what to do next. I remember people would ask me like, hey, what's next? Or I'd run into someone on the street, a stranger, and they'd be like, oh, you were Miss Universe. What's next? And I felt like such a failure with not being able to say, I don't know what's next. and I am okay with that. I'm not going to sit on my couch and watch Netflix all day, although that does sound nice occasionally. I might do that after this book is out on shelves. But I actually have to go and work through that waiting season. And I think something when we're going through a waiting season and we feel like it's just a wasted season, so much on of the focus in that season is on me having to fix that, me having to come up with the plan. That responsibility, you kind of put that all on yourself. And something that I learned that really helped me through that season, I write a whole chapter about this, but two practical things that I did, Hannah, was to one, go and serve someone, to actually physically go and notice somebody else. Because while you're waiting in your waiting season and it feels like a wasted season, well, if you still get to have impact, it's not wasted. And maybe while you're waiting for your next step, maybe somebody else is waiting for you to show up and be that helping hand that they need. And, something so practical that I did, I lived in New York City, and that the best thing I knew to do was to find the nearest soup kitchen. And I did. And I took the F train and I went downtown. And I know this sounds so cliche, but I just got to go and cook for other people for a couple of hours in the day. And it just removed the focus off of me, even just for a few hours. And it truly helped put so much into perspective. I know a soup kitchen sounds so cliche, but that's genuinely what I did in that moment. And I went multiple times a month, and it was just so helpful to get that focus off of myself and onto somebody else. Something else practical that I did was to surround myself with people, with community. Because when we're in those waiting seasons, Hannah, we can so easily feel, like I said with that carjacking situation, that you feed yourself all these lies. But when you surround yourself with people that can point you back to the truth and the one and only truth and who he says you are, that is helpful. The Bible talks so much about seeking wise counsel. And honestly, Hannah, I think the reason that waiting season was so difficult for me was because I didn't have friends around me that necessarily cared more about me than what they wanted from me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I relate again. There are so many things in your story that I relate to, but the waiting season for me looked like moving to a new state, moving away from family and friends, to having a newborn, having a husband gone 250, 300 days a year, uh,
Crazy.
postpartum depression, just totally isolated and alone,
Mm-hmm.
and really wrestling with what am I doing? I
Mm-hmm.
had quit my job, and that identity struggle of who am I? Why am I here? And I felt like that wait was a years long wait. And even when I, climbed out of that, when God pulled me out of that, I began to see. And I think a good prayer to pray when you're in a waiting season is, God, give me eyes to see you, ears to hear you, and a heart to recognize you,
Mm.
so that while I'm here, I can be looking for you and seeing you in it. Because for some reason, if you are able to see God in the wait, then by the time you are out of the wait, you can see so much more clearly the preparation that God was doing in you in that time. I remember getting to a point where I was like, I have a lot of eyes on me because of who I'm married to. It felt like a lot of pressure to look a certain way. Again, I had no community, no support, but I just thought, if all these people are going to look at me, I'm going to point them up, because it's not about me. And
Mm.
it's just like you said, the more you take yourself out of the equation,
Yeah.
the more you are able to move forward knowing that it's
Mm-hmm.
bigger than me, that God is working something and he will work it to his good.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start looking at other people, and I think it's beautiful because the Bible tells us, do unto others as you would have them do to you. I
Mm-hmm.
tell the boys that all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
so if I'm more busy trying to treat people the way that I would want to be treated in
Mm-hmm.
any given situation in life, that removes the me and the self and the
Yeah.
pride and the control. It removes all of the things that really Satan wants to keep us trapped in. It's like, if he can't keep us distracted, then maybe he can keep us focused on ourselves.
Yeah.
But if we can turn our eyes up, and if we can turn our eyes to others, and you mentioned this in your book, but it's that eternal work, right? It's that eternal purpose in the work that we're doing that's not actually for us at all. We are here, we are given, Shay and I get so excited about this because we are given the opportunity to live a lifetime, if we are fortunate to live a whole lifetime, which is but a vapor in the Bible, but we live it for the glory of God, and we live it to bring other people in and to encourage and to give them hope and to show them why we're here, and that is because of the Creator who made us, right?
Yeah, I love that so much, Hannah. Hannah, it reminds me of like just the word self-confidence. You mentioned just that focus on ourselves. Maybe the enemy can't distract us, but he distracts us by focusing on ourselves, right? And the word confidence just truly translates to meaning full trust. And so if you say hey, I should have self-confidence, well, I've tried that, and I have tried having full trust in myself, and I don't know about you, but man, I have failed miserably. And if I'm going to keep trying to have self-confidence at one point or another, I'm going to let myself down, and I'm certainly going to let other people down. And so I have come to the conclusion that I want to substitute the word self for something different, because there's a different type of confidence that we get to have that is bigger than ourselves, that is fixed, that is never changing, and that is always trustworthy. Because myself, I am none of those things. Like I said, I'm going to fail miserably. I'm going to make a mess at some point. But changing out that word self for something that fits that description of those four things, that's fixed, that's never changing, that's always trustworthy, and that's bigger than myself, is God confidence. I don't have to have self confidence when I get to have God confidence. And why do we get to have confidence in who God is because of his track record over and over and over, proving that he is not just a promise maker, but that he is the ultimate promise keeper. And that is why we get to have not self confidence, but God confidence. And like you say, I hope I never point people to myself. I hope that if people look at me, I'm going to fail at this too, Hannah, but I'm going to try and point them to the one that will never, ever fail them.
That's right. I'm just reminded so much of a conversation I just had recently on the podcast with my sister-in-law. And I was just recounting with her, like, she asked me about confidence. And I was just sharing with her a moment where God revealed to me, we actually did a listening prayer at some point with a small group of women. And we were asked to ask God to show us how he sees us. And I'm really visual, and God speaks to me and shows me pictures, and he just like flashed me back to, and this sounds really silly, but the moment that I won my crown. And I was very timid and very quiet, very little confidence in myself, did not want to be seen or noticed, kind of a child. God flashed me back to that moment, not because of the crown and not because of feeling like you're beautiful in the moment, but he flashed me back and said, "This is how I see you, my daughter.
Yeah.
I love you, and you are beautiful and seen and chosen. You
Yeah.
are beloved, and this is how you are my daughter, and this is how I see you." And that changed everything for me, because moving forward, it wasn't about, who I was to the world, but I knew who I was to the one who made me.
Yeah.
And knowing that enables you to step into a room and you do have this air of confidence, but it's not of self. It's
Yeah.
it's this confidence because you know who made you, and you don't need anything from anyone. You need no validation from people. You need no validation from the world. And there's something very attractive, especially I think in an industry. I know that we're more on the music side, but even you know that when you have a platform and when you are seen and you have a lot of visibility into your life and your husband's life, that could be challenging. But it's less challenging when you're stepping into these places knowing that you have nothing to prove to people. And that attracts. People are attracted to that. They'll say, what is it about you? And I think at the end of the day, it's that we don't need anything from them.
Yeah.
In fact, we don't need anything from them, but we are able to give what God has given us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is hope and encouragement and all these, the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience. I think that is an effect that people can feel. And it's just, the Bible says that by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, I think that living our life as a testimony can be just as impactful as
Right.
the words that we say, right?
That's
It's
right.
the life we're living.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Hannah, my whole book, if I could pick one verse that I would say would sum up my whole book, A Crown That Lost, it would be 1 Corinthians 9:25. And it says, I'm going to read it to you. Everyone, I have it up here in my office. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last. You and I relate, right? But we do it to get a crown that will last forever. And what Paul is referring to here is he's actually referring to the Isthmian Games. That is like a rivalry. I know we're going into the Olympics here soon, but what he's talking to is the Isthmian Games used to be like a big rival games to the Olympic Games in the city of Izmia. And Paul is writing this letter to the church of Corinth saying, hey guys, like, don't chase a perishable crown. And what he's referring to is the prize that the athletes at the Isthmian Games get. Some scholars believe that some of these athletes went into such strict training that it was so brutal that before they even like got to the games to go and compete, some of the athletes actually lost their lives. It was that hard. Like that was how much these athletes were willing to give up, to sacrifice for this prize. And this prize, this crown that Paul is referring to, is a crown made up of pine, or depending on the season, celery or olive tree leaves. I mean, Hannah, talk about a crown that didn't last.
Right.
My crown was made up of diamonds and pearls, but they just had a head salad, basically. I don't know how much you care about celery juice. I know it's good for you and all, but those leaves are not lasting. And it just speaks to, the things that we chase in this lifetime on this earth, that we try to attach and find our value, worth, and ultimate purpose in. And my hope and my heart really for this book is that every reader that reads A Crown That Lost will be able to go and build a lasting confidence, find their God-given identity, and will be able to go and live that out with confidence. Because we don't have to focus on the crown on our head that isn't going to last, but we get to have full trust, full confidence in who our creator says we are. He made us, and he tells us throughout the Bible the way that he views us, the way that he sees us. The Bible tells us that humanity is the crown of creation. You are the crown of creation. That is how much he loves you. That is how much he cares for you. And believe it or not, but he has a perfect, perfect, beautiful plan for your life.
Yes. And let's be honest, a lot of times that plan looks nothing like we thought it was going to look, right?
But
Uh,
usually a whole lot better than we could ever imagine. Yes.
Usually better. I love to refer to that. It's like a meme or a cartoon years ago of this picture of Jesus that took away a little teddy bear from like a crying child.
I love that one.
And then
Yes.
you see behind his back is like this
Yeah.
teddy bear that's the size of a house, and the
Yeah.
child was crying, but he had so much more, and he does.
Mm-hmm.
He has so much more for us.
Mm-hmm.
It is. I think it is up to us to be able to say yes in obedience
Mm-hmm.
when the thing is taken away from us.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's up to us to step in obedience and say, "Okay, God, I'm going to lay down and surrender
Mm-hmm.
my plans for myself. I'm going to lay down and surrender what I thought was best for me. And I'm going to ask you to lead me. Let Holy Spirit lead me. Help me make my decisions, my choices. Open all the right doors, close all the wrong doors,
Yeah.
Lord. And I'm just trusting you
Mm-hmm.
because you are my best yes.
Yeah.
Whatever I say yes to that is from you will be for my good.
Yeah.
And really for the good of those
Yeah.
around me, every life that we touch.
I agree, Hannah. I do think that there can be so much blessing in obedience. And I write a lot about how the Lord has used pain in my life, but because I was willing to give it to Him, He has turned that into purpose for His glory. And He has used the messes in my life and turned it into a message for His glory. And the trials in my life, He has turned that into a triumph for His glory. I have also learned that when you give it to the Lord, and when you say, Lord, I am willing, you use this for your glory, you gotta be careful because He can, and a lot of times He will use that, in the most beautiful, unexpected ways. One of my favorite stories about just stepping up in obedience and how that can turn into a blessing is the story of Ruth and Naomi in the Bible, where Ruth's husband died. Super sad story. Her brother-in-law died, her father-in-law died, and she was basically left with just her and her mother-in-law. And she did the thing that she thought was right by going back, which was culturally kind of unheard of, going back to her mother-in-law Naomi's hometown where she knew nobody. She could have stayed where she was at and started over, started a new life where she had friends, where she had a community, but she went back with her mother-in-law. She did the thing that she thought was right, and she picked up scraps in the field. And this man Boaz eventually noticed her, not because of her beauty or her charm, but because of her obedience, the way that she was loyal and faithful to her mother-in-law. They didn't even share the same belief at that time. And long story short, the story of Ruth turns out so beautiful, where she ends up being part of Jesus Christ's lineage by being the great grandmother to the future King David. So I love that story so much. And I always have to remind myself that it's not a story. The Bible isn't just a story, it's a Bible reality. And it's a reality that, yes, maybe happened somewhat 2,000 years ago, but that is applicable to our lives right now, right here.
I love that. I actually covered that story in one episode, a couple of years ago, but I love it. And it's what you said, that obedience, and not just the obedience to follow after her mother-in-law, but she said, where you go, I will go, and your God will be my God.
Yeah.
She chose God. Not
Mm-hmm.
only did she choose her mother-in-law, but she chose God.
Yeah.
And in that, God was faithful, and she
Yeah.
was a part of the lineage of Jesus. It's like you said, it's such a beautiful illustration of how God will use anyone. God will use anyone who is willing
Yeah.
to choose Him and
Mm-hmm.
say yes to Him.
Yeah.
I also love that you talk about, the purpose in the pain, because I think oftentimes that is where people may struggle with, well, what is my ministry, or what are my giftings, or what is God going to call me to do that is beyond myself. A lot of times when you do the digging and you go back to those places or those wounds or those hurts, the brokenness, those places of brokenness will become the places that you can speak into and bring hope for other women. And I know that this is used a lot, especially in the Christian sphere, but I did a women's conference, and I just brought the illustration of a bowl, and I broke it, and then I tried to tape it up with tape, and then I showed the Japanese art of kintsugi, which
Yeah.
is when they mend the broken pieces with actual gold. And not only is it more beautiful once it's repaired, but it is more costly.
Yeah.
And that is a visual of when you go back to those places, and you dig up the wounds, and you dig up the lies that you've believed, and you let God have it, and surrender, and you let Him heal those places.
Yeah.
That's when at the end you will hold up this beautiful, life, and this masterpiece, and you say, it was broken, but now isn't it so beautiful? And this is what God can do for you too. It's
Yeah.
that shared, it's really our pains and our brokenness and our stories are the places where we will most touch other people's lives, right? Because those are the places that we can relate personally
Yeah.
to other people's brokenness.
Hannah, I love that art form, kintsugi. I love it. It's so beautiful. I wish I had a pot like that. I might have to check Etsy or something. But like I told you, I'm such a practical, such a visual person, and in that moment, moment, we can't see the value that could come from something that's broken, something that's hurtful, something that's painful. Tim and I had the opportunity to visit Greece a couple of years ago. He was hosting the Special Olympic World Games in Berlin, and we bopped over to Greece for just a few short days, and we got to follow a little bit of Paul's footsteps. And one thing that we learned, we were in this museum, and our tour guide showed us a mirror, but I'm like, that's not a mirror. I can't even like see if my face is shiny or not. It was like, like the cute like anthropology antique mirrors that are like, they're useless, they're pretty, but they're totally like, you can't see anything in them. They're like all, patchy and stuff. Well, that's pretty much what this mirror was about. And that's not that exact mirror that we saw, but mirrors like it is what First Corinthians 13:12 is based on. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face, now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, just as I am also fully known. What he's referring to is, in this lifetime, or in that moment where we are buried in pain, buried in hurt, it's so hard to see the full picture. But one day, when God chooses to show us the full picture, there is a much bigger picture. We now just see in a mirror that is all blurry, that is all, brassy. Imagine looking into a piece of brass as a mirror, right? Like that's the type of mirror that he was referring to. And I think that's just so much of what our faith is trusting that he's got it, regardless of what we can see right now.
That's right. That is so good. And I mean, look at your life, look at your story. How incredible is it that God would take someone that, by the world standard, has the title, has the crown, has the success, but then in this beautiful way, it's stripped and you're broken and you have to go back. And then your whole story is just this testimony to share to millions of women that it can look a certain way to the world, but until you know the true worth and the true value and the true identity of who God says you are and what God has called you to, only then will you have the peace and the real success of life. And that is that we get to, glorify God in all that we do.
That's right.
I just think it's so beautiful. What an unexpected story. And I feel like God has such a sense of humor. I do. I feel like I have a list of questions that I want to ask him when I go to heaven one day, but I just have this feeling that he's got such a good sense of humor because I get the opportunity to speak to so many people on this podcast, and they share their life and their story. And again, I'm so thankful, Demi, for people like you who have gone through what you've gone through, and then you are willing to be vulnerable and courageous, really, to share the work that God has done in you so that other people then have that hope and are then encouraged to also pursue that. Because when I see you, yes, you're gorgeous, but your heart is just radiant for Christ. And I think that is just undeniable to anyone who is willing to share their life for the better of others.
You're so sweet, Hannah. Thank you so much for having me. And I feel like we need to have a catch up and a dinner sometime soon. Nashville always has the best food spots. So coming from a foodie.
Next time y'all are in town, please give me a call.
Of
One
course.
question I did want to
Yeah.
ask you. I was only thinking about this because I analyze everything. As you did this work
Yeah.
of digging, and as you did this work on yourself, and you're reviewing, and you're seeing the pieces that God is wanting to take away, or the things that he's wanting to replace with his truths, what part did Tim have in this? Because I will say, even though Shay and I did an intensive marriage retreat together, the work was done separately.
Yeah.
Right? We both did the work.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still doing the work, but we did the work separately. And I think that there's such a beautiful part of doing a little bit of that work in front of him
Mm-hmm.
as my husband, even for him to see pieces of me, of my past, that maybe he did not know or wasn't aware of, and allowing him to step into that broken place. I think that for us was really eye-opening, and even me for him, there were moments in his life, and you really see each other as the child who, whatever, Did you, I guess my question is, did you feel like you were closer because of the work that you were doing, because that vulnerability wasn't just with you and God, but like your husband got to see it, and then that strengthened your marriage? Because I know on our end it really, really did.
One of the things that I'm just grateful for that he did was he pointed me to the truth. He allowed me to just sit in this moment that I needed to sit in and work through it. I one thing that I appreciate so much about Tim is his honesty and his transparency. And one of the greatest forms of love that the Bible talks about is agape form of love. And I think the verb is agapo, if I'm not mistaken. And it means to choose the best interest of another person and to go and act on their behalf. And so, he didn't just allow me to necessarily sit in this, but he challenged me to be better, to do better, to pour into my life, and to do things that will set me up to be able to take another step forward. And I'm so thankful for the way that Tim has loved me throughout that waiting season and never looked down on me for, the moments where I felt like a failure. He saw me as a princess in the eyes of my maker, and he treated me that way regardless. And I'm so thankful for that. But I'm thankful for the ways that he's also chosen my best interest and acted on my behalf by maybe sometimes challenging me, maybe sometimes pulling me up when I couldn't necessarily pull myself up. So yeah, definitely so thankful to have been able to walk through this season hand in hand with a partner that loves me, that cares for me, and that I genuinely know has my best interests at heart.
I love that. That's so good. Well, Demi, I cannot thank you enough, not just for being on today, but for your honesty, for the courage it has taken to share your life in book form so beautifully. You are going to touch lives, you're going to change lives. You already are an inspiration and an encouragement to so many. But I can't wait to hear all of the feedback that you get from this book, because I just know that when we get to heaven one day, we'll really get to see the full impact. And
That's
I'm
right.
just so grateful for you for that.
That's right. Thank you so much, Hannah. It was so good to see you again. I wish I could give you a big virtual hug.
So good to see you. Until we talk again, I love you and I hope you have a great week.
Right back at you, lady. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening today. If this episode has encouraged you, please feel free to share the show with your family and friends. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today, and my hope is that this show is a candle in the dark.